Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Kentucky Kernel News Podcast, the University of Kentucky's student award-winning newspaper. I'm Giana Gallo, your co-host, and due to a convention in Atlanta, our host, Nate Lucas, is unable to join us today, but hopefully coming home with awards. In today's episode, I will interview Professor Al Cross, a journalist with a history in election coverage. You'll hear about his career, how he's covered previous elections, and his thoughts on the upcoming November 7th governor election. A quick disclaimer, the opinions expressed on this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the opinions held by the Kentucky Kernel. All right, let's go. Hello, Professor Cross, and welcome to the Kentucky Kernel News Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to introduce yourself and tell me about your field in journalism and where you are now.
I'm Al Cross. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Institute for Rural Journalism at the University of Kentucky. And I'm probably better known as a political commentator, which is why you're talking to me today.
What attracted you to the field of journalism?
Well, that is a very long story. How much time do we have?
Much minutes as you want, please.
Well, when I was growing up as a kid, I was about 4 years old or 5 years old when our small town finally got a radio station. And I could see its tower light from our house. It was about a mile and a half away, but it really shone out, especially at sunset. And that was the time when the station would sign off. And I became sort of intrigued with the station, and I memorized the sign-off script. I was sort of a precocious kid, and so when I was 6 years old, my very proud father took me out to the station one night to recite the sign-off script. They stuck a microphone in front of me, and I froze. So I came back home with a lot of UPI wire copy that I found very fascinating, and started watching sports on television, baseball in particular, because my father's friend, Pee Wee Reese, was one of the announcers on the only game of the week that was on television. This was 1963. And I noticed that they kept referring to someone who seemed important but was never shown, and that was the official scorer, the person who decided if a batted ball resulted in a hit or an error. And I went to the library one day, and laying out on the table, I think somebody had probably done this in anticipation of my arrival, was a book called How to Score Baseball Games. So I took the book home and began keeping score of the Major League games as I watched them on television. And the Little League and Babe Ruth League commissioner in Albany, Kentucky, invited me to be the scorekeeper. And he added, and if you want to, you can write up the games for the local paper. So on July 11th, 1965, I got my first byline in the Clinton County News at the age of 11.
Oh, my goodness.
So I've been in journalism a long time.
A long time. So you went from sports to when you went to your actual career to political. And I was reading a lot about you, and you won a lot of awards. It's extremely impressive.
Well, I've been around a long time, and journalism is an awards-giving business,
Yes.
Not many other people outside journalism are going to give us awards, so we give ourselves lots of awards.
You're inducted in the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame, and you, in 1989, you won a Pulitzer Prize.
Well, I and other members of the Courier-Journal staff, lots of people contributed to that.
Yeah, on the nation's deadliest bus crash.
And drunk driving crash.
Oh, my goodness. What was that like?
Well, it was pretty intense because we had to find out as much as we could about what happened, including a profile of the man who caused the accident.
Wow.
And we couldn't talk to him because he was behind police guard in the hospital. So I had to spend about 6 hours finding out as much as I could about him and write a profile of him for the day after's newspaper. And that was one of the more difficult assignments I ever had, but it was cited in the Pulitzer citation, I should say that the immediate reporting, of which mine was a part, was cited in the citation. So I think we gave people a pretty good idea of what Larry Mahoney had been through in his life before he caused that tragic accident.
Mm-hmm. And, like you said, you started reporting or, journalism when you were 11. You've had a long career in this field. What has been your favorite story you've covered on, or something that's a story that's just always stuck with you, good or bad?
Well, there's thousands of stories, but probably the experience I remember most is being on the bus trip with Bill Clinton and Al Gore after their nomination in 1992.
Oh, my goodness.
We always covered, as political writer, we always covered the conventions. And during the convention, the Clinton campaign announced it was mounting this bus trip that would go from New York, side of the convention, to St. Louis, and it would come right through Kentucky, through Louisville even, and I was working for the Louisville newspaper, the Courier-Journal. So I got on the bus and did some interviews an interview of Al Gore that was sort of a surprise to him, and file stories from the bus trip. And I think really, gave people a pretty good idea of what the campaign was talking about and the sort of lift that it had gotten from the convention and the reaction it was getting from voters. It wasn't any great pieces of journalism, but it was really an interesting experience to be on the bus with national reporters and all trying to get some kind of story that somebody else didn't have.
That's so fascinating.
The run up to that was was about 2 hours from catching the bus, and I was just walking down the street in New York, and I ran into Senator Albert Gore Sr., former senator, and he had with him his grandson Albert Gore III. Oh. And I'm from southern Kentucky, not far from where the Gores have their farm. And we were talking about people and places that we knew, and he was talking about his farm and motioned to his grandson that, I showed him the irrigation system we had for the tobacco, and he said, "Granddaddy, doesn't that kill people? We never grew another stick."
Oh, my God.
So this figured greatly in Al Gore's career. Mm-hmm. In 1996, he gave a speech at the Democratic Convention in which he basically said he was sorry for ever supporting tobacco, which used to be a pretty important crop in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And I was able to ask him about what his father had told me in this surprise interview, and he was somewhat taken aback.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, right, you've, again, going through your timeline in life, right, covering little milestones throughout your career. What brought you to UK?
Well, in 1970, I thought I wanted to come to UK to get into radio because I was primarily a radio guy at that time. And I went to WUKY and asked if there were any opportunities for students and was bluntly told by the person running the board, no. So UK was off my list, and I went to Western Kentucky University, which had just been the recipient of a lot of equipment and other largesse from Julian Goodman of NBC, who was the first cousin of D. Downing, the president of Western. Looked like a good place to learn broadcasting. And I started in the broadcast curriculum, but got sidetracked into print, or text as I call it now, and have been there ever since.
Nice. So with this election coming up, next Tuesday, I want to kind of go into your background and political coverage. So what exactly did you do for, elections? What is your background in covering elections?
Well, I covered local elections when I was a weekly newspaper editor and manager. When I joined the Courier-Journal in 1978, I covered a congressional race in central Kentucky and showed some aptitude for covering politics, so was assigned to cover the governor's race along with other Courier-Journal reporters in 1979. That got me my first helicopter ride with John Y. Brown Jr. on the first day of my coverage. And in 1980, I began covering the legislature, and I've covered every regular session of the legislature in some form or fashion since then. Became political writer in 1989, and in that job, you're responsible for all levels of political coverage from local races to the presidency. And you also have the opportunity to write columns. And I like to say that if you're a political writer without a column, it's like going bear hunting with a switch because you have to be able to make politicians realize that if they're not really straight with you for a news story, you can hold their feet to the fire in a column.
Sure can. How was it, when I guess nowadays, newsrooms tend to lean towards political party. When you were...
No, they don't. Most newsrooms do not. Good newsrooms do not. We don't have enough good newsrooms these days, but most newsrooms are not political. When people watch cable TV, they see the sorts of messages and framing that they want to see, and that's what cable TV news is mostly about. They're giving people confirmation instead of information. But that's not what most newsrooms are about.
How do you sway? Is it for you easy to not have bias?
It's not easy, but it's not all that hard either because I've been doing it for 50 years. It helps to have grown up in a Republican family in what was a Democratic state and working for a Democratic newspaper that prided itself on journalistic independence. The Binghams were good Democrats, but under Barry Bingham Jr., the Courier-Journal endorsed Republicans and could not be depended on to carry water for the Democrats, and that's what journalism ought to be. I subscribe to the kind of journalism that he idealized, and that's one reason I was president of the Society of Professional Journalists about 20 years ago, because a core tenet of SPJ is ethics. And one clear tenet of the Code of Ethics is to not show favoritism, especially in politics. You can't be carrying water for one side or the other, and you have to be careful as being seen not carrying one side or the other.
You were the Kentucky Educational Television KET election night commentator. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I still do that, and there are a number of other commentators, but I'm the one who fills the nonpartisan slot. There are other commentators like Bob Babbage, a Democrat, and Trey Grayson, a Republican, both of whom were secretaries of state, and then more partisan people from either side. But Renee Shaw, the moderator, and I are both, we're essentially nonpartisan. And I'm sorry I didn't turn my phone off before we started this activity. Go ahead.
Right. So going back to how did you form questions, or what was something going into this covering elections, because that is a huge deal. What was kind of the mindset that you walked into going to that event?
Well, the primary question that ought to be on any journalist's mind is why. We report who, what, where, and when, but why is usually not immediately apparent. And sometimes politicians want to conceal why. So you report on their campaign finance, you report on their backgrounds, you report on who their friends are, and you ask them direct questions about those things. And you find out more about the why or the possible why of who and what they are.
So going into this upcoming election, governor election, what do you look for in a candidate?
Well, there's no real difference in this election and another election, but you asked me a question that really doesn't fit the job. What am I looking for in a candidate? As a voter, as a reporter, I'm not looking for anything in particular as a reporter because I don't want to go in with any kind of preconceived notions about what a person ought to be or who the ideal candidate would be. That's part of being unbiased. You can't be completely unbiased. We all have beliefs and convictions, but journalists with experience learn how to keep those out of their reporting. It's not as hard as some people seem to think.
I agree with you. What is something in the candidates' campaign that stick out to you from both Cameron and Beshear?
Well, Beshear is rather unusual in that he's a Democrat running on abortion. That has been a problematic issue for Democrats for a long time because Republicans appeal to passionate voters who believe that life begins at conception, and if there's any sort of compromise, it shouldn't be much compromise. But the Supreme Court moved the ball to the other side of the field. Now Beshear can attack Daniel Cameron for being against rape and incest exceptions to the state's near-total ban on abortions. Most people are in favor of those exceptions, and Cameron painted himself into a corner in the primary by opposing them, and he doesn't want to change his position. Now he says that if the legislature sends him a bill with those exceptions, he'll sign it, but he clearly is not going to advocate it on his own, and the legislature is highly unlikely to pass such a bill unless he got behind it. So that's really an interesting facet of the Beshear campaign. They've been able to turn this reliably Republican issue to their advantage. Cameron's campaign has been one that's tried to nationalize the election. He knows this is a strong Donald Trump state, and he's trying to get those Donald Trump supporters to come out and vote for him because he's a Trump guy. But I think he's been a little reluctant to defend Trump in the face of these indictments. After all, Cameron is the chief law enforcement officer of the Commonwealth. And while he still says he's proud to be endorsed by Trump, he's not really defended him against these charges, which would be, really a clash of interest if he tried to do that. It's not in his political interest to do that, but there are some who think that maybe that's got Trump a little miffed, and Trump may not come to Kentucky to campaign for Cameron personally. And I think if that's the case, then Cameron's probably sunk. I think he's got to have Trump come to town to have a chance. And even then, I don't think it would make the difference, but you never know. This is a Republican trending state. And even though Beshear has led in every public poll, Republicans tend to poll a little lower in surveys than they do on Election Day. And Trump is still a very popular figure in this state.
So this governor's election is this year. The following year is presidential election. I know there's been rumors that if Beshear were to win, that might be a segue into his, possible election or candidacy for president. Do you see that in his future, or
not in the immediate future? Because I think a lot of voters of Kentucky would see it as an insult or highly self-serving if he was elected governor and then immediately started running for president. And after all, the Democrats do have a candidate for president at this point. Mm-hmm. Now, if something happened to Joe Biden in, say, May or June of 2024, and Democrats had to scramble for a candidate, Beshear might be an attractive candidate because he's proven he can win Republican votes. Now, the circumstances are special, if not unique. He was judged to have handled the pandemic very well, and that got reinforced by how he handled natural disasters. And I think people have essentially made up their minds about Andy Beshear in Kentucky. That doesn't mean that they would make up their minds about him in other states, or that he could carry a Democratic National Convention that was thrown open.
So now to the college level. Why is voting so important for college students?
Well, students need to realize that what government officials do affects their lives. Student loans and tuition costs, abortion rights. There's any number of issues you could talk about that students would find important. Sometimes they're couched in ways that students don't have a lot of patience for. But if they take a couple of minutes to really look at the issues that are in play, I think they'll find that the governor's race has things they should care about.
I completely agree. If you feel comfortable sharing this, what are your predictions for this election?
Well, I think it's likely that Beshear is going to win, but you can't really rule out a Cameron victory, and Trump remains the X factor. Let's say Donald Trump came in for Daniel Cameron and motivated voters in the same way that he did in 2018 when Amy McGrath was running neck and neck with Andy Barr in this congressional district. After Trump came in, Barr led and won the race. Trump is unlikely to have exactly the same effect in a race for governor where people pretty much made up their minds about Beshear, but the key is turnout. Not very many people are going to be persuaded by the arguments in this election. The key for both candidates is to turn out people who are already for them in polls. The polls you read probably anticipate statistically a turnout of 60 or 70%. That is not going to happen. Turnout is likely to be about half that. And that's why turnout is the most essential ingredient in the formula for winning this election at this point. And that's why both these candidates are making bus tours around the state, trying to look voters in the eye, drum up some excitement, get the word of mouth going. There's an old saying in politics, you got to get the talk right. And right now the talk is not in favor of Daniel Cameron, but with Donald Trump's help and some good appearances around the state, he could change that.
So with all of this history on elections and your advice to students to vote, if the ideal world you could if you could talk to Daniel Cameron and Andy Beshear, what is one question you would ask them?
Well, that's the kind of thing that usually takes a few minutes of reflection before you come up with the really pointed question, the true salient that will get to the heart of the matter. I think Cameron has proven that he won't answer such questions. I asked him 3 times what his verdict was on the 2020 election. Do you believe it was fairly decided? And he has always refused to answer that question. So, yes, you can think of great questions to ask politicians, but that doesn't mean they have to answer them.
Of course.
And unfortunately, the fractionalization of the news media, the shattering of the audiences into smaller pieces means that fewer people watch network news or read mainstream newspapers that have always been the questioners that forced these questions onto candidates and in some cases made them answer. Those news outlets have less power these days, and the candidates are doing less answering.
Do you feel like social media plays a part in the candidates' campaign?
Of course. Social media is today the primary source of information for most Americans. Now, it's not the primary source of reliable news. I'll give you my elevator speech.
Please.
The news business pays for journalism, which practices a discipline of verification. We tell you how we know something, or we quote somebody as saying it, and we're primarily about fact, not about opinion. Social media are primarily about opinion, not fact, and they have little, if any, discipline or verification. Who are you going to trust?
That is a great elevator speech.
Thank you.
That was very good. That left me kind of thinking.
I've given it about 500 times, so I do have some practice.
That definitely left me thinking. So my last question to you is, right, the Kentucky Kernel Podcast is for students, obviously UK, all of the Lexington community. but mainly for students. What is a message you want to give them about voting? Because I know, as you know, when my mom and parents told me, register to vote, I was a little apprehensive, and I don't know why I was, because it's extremely important to vote. But I was a little timid in registering and going for some reason. But
it's an adult thing, right?
It is.
It's one of those adult things that you have never done before. So, maybe it's natural to be a little apprehensive.
Mm-hmm. What is something you want to tell students about voting, again, why it is important and why their vote matters?
Students need to realize that they are just as much citizens as us old folks, and they are never going to get their just desserts from the government unless they exercise their voting rights. Politicians are free to ignore the wishes of young people because they don't vote enough. If young people voted more, they'd be happier.
That's a great way to end this podcast. Thank you so much, Professor Cross, for coming on. I appreciate all the things you have educated me on and the viewers, and especially about this election. I'll be curious to see if your prediction is correct.
Well, I shy away from making predictions.
Yes.
I talk about likelihoods. And why it might go one way or why it might go the other way. And hopefully I haven't missed any of the key points.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Is Scoops Out of the Litter, where I tell you the top headlines every college kid should know. So on the national and Kentucky level, 33 states sue Meta, which is the corporation that owns Facebook, Instagram, Threads, WhatsApp, for harming young people's mental health. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in California, and they claim that Meta continuously collects data on children under 13 without parental consent. This is obviously a violation of federal law. The lawsuit is resulting in an investigation led by a bipartisan coalition of attorneys from California, Florida, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Nebraska, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Vermont. Just recently, Meta agreed to fork over $725 million to Facebook users to settle allegations that is shared privately, and their private information with third parties. So my first question to you, what social media do you have?
I use Facebook and X.
Ooh, X. Do you like that Twitter has turned into X, or you like Twitter?
I like Twitter. There was some reasonable control. Donald Trump was banned from Twitter because of the things he did, and he should have been.
Would you ever consider getting Instagram?
I do have an Instagram account that I don't use very much because I had it when I was publishing the Midway Messenger with my students. So I'm at Al Cross Midway on Instagram, but I don't go to Midway much anymore, so it's not very active.
How do you feel like social media affects younger generations?
I really worry about it. I think it has limited the really natural human connections between people. I find student journalists want to do all their interviews by email. They don't want to call people on the phone. If you're going to be a journalist, you need to be able to have a conversation with people. And frankly, if you want to be a fully functioning member of society, you need to be able to talk to strangers in a civil way. I just think that it provides such an easy way out, and I'm referring to email, but social media is the same sort of principle. You say things on social media you would never say to people when you were looking them in the eye.
I completely agree.
And that makes for a lot of divisiveness and polarization, which is not a good thing.
I completely agree with you. I think social media, especially, my parents did not allow me to have social media until I was in high school. So I am truly grateful for that, because I feel, looking at my friends in middle school, my vague memories in middle school, I could see the difference between them and me and their social life versus mine. And I feel like I was much more present. And I think that's something that, being a college kid, I'm realizing even more, is everybody's looking down at their phone and you know that they're on a social media app. tweeting, posting on Instagram, doing a TikTok.
And that's part of what this Meta lawsuit, the lawsuit against Meta, is about. The allegation is that this is sort of an addiction. Researchers have been reluctant to really say it's an addiction, but there is certainly a compelling nature of these platforms, and there's a compulsion to keep on looking. What am I missing? What can I say? I think that's in the long term unhealthy. I think we need to give more thoughtful consideration to what we say, especially online, because it seems so easy to say things that you would not say face to face.
Yeah, being a journalist as well, what are your opinions on other journalists getting their first news from social media?
Well, I think journalists have to be in the business of getting information wherever they can, but testing its reliability at all times. You see something on social, you want to track it down and say, well, who's saying this? Is it reliable information or not? I don't see anything wrong with journalists using social media both to gather and to disseminate information. I think it's the primary platform for Americans to get information these days, and journalists have to be there. I wish they would take more opportunity to explain to people on social media the difference in social media and news media. We in the news media do a bad job of that ourselves. We just say media when we mean news media. There's a real difference between news and social, and we need to say news media.
I never really thought of that before you said that. That's completely true. Yeah, I feel like those do get mixed up because when you say media, I think social media, not
and
news.
I think news media.
So last question for you about this Meta case lawsuit. Do you feel like more states are going to start to file lawsuits with Meta?
No, I think once you've got these 33 or 41 states, there's a little bit of a dichotomy about exactly how many sued. You've probably seen most of the states that are going to be involved. In the tobacco litigation, I think they started out with about that many, and then all but one or two other states joined, and finally Kentucky joined once it saw there was going to be a settlement and they won part of the money. So you may see that happen, but in terms of litigating the case, I think the players you have are the attorneys general who are on the case and the states that are otherwise plaintiffs.
Gotcha. All right, now going to my favorite news, Kernel News. This, for viewers who are watching, this is this new special section of the Kentucky Kernel. For those who are just listening, you will definitely not miss this.
Well, we can rustle the paper.
Yes, there it is. It has a bunch of voter pins on it with Cameron Brashear telling voters to vote. So make sure you pick up the Kentucky Kernel special section to kind of get more details and profiles on each candidate's campaign and read all of our amazing articles from our reporters and editors.
And there's a whole center spread about issues. Yes. Abortion, higher education, COVID-19, LGBTQ+, and a story about student organizations promoting political activity, and an endorsement of the incumbent. A lot of newspapers don't make endorsements anymore. They think people see that as arrogant. They also are afraid of getting tagged with a partisan label or a ideological label, which is usually liberal. But newspaper endorsements, I think, are generally a good thing. Newspapers have more information than most voters, and they can analyze that information and come up with reasonable positions to suggest that voters go one way or the other. I think it's particularly important in lesser races where there's less information. Who in the world knows what's going on in the treasurer's race? The Herald Leader, to its credit, has endorsed in all the statewide races, and I'm sure they've given many voters information they did not have about those candidates. And those endorsements can make a difference in a close race. I don't think any of those races are going to be close, other than governor. But I think it's useful for newspapers to explore these issues and help voters who, frankly, need help.
The Kernel just this year moved digital. So we still obviously have newspapers, but it's just special sections. So I believe it's for a semester. What are your thoughts on this? Do you like digital newspapers?
I think there'll always be a need for printed information that people can set aside and then refer to. The weekly newspapers that are a great focus of the Institute for Rural Journalism, of which I'm Director Emeritus, are sort of like magazines in that they lie around the house all week. People may read them, but then they go back and look for something that, they're may have heard something and said, oh, wait a minute, I saw something about that in the paper. Let me go back and look at it. And these papers often don't put everything online, and there are still plenty of people out there, and granted, they're my age, not yours, who would prefer to go to something printed as opposed to searching around online. In some cases, it's more convenient to pick up a paper and look through it. I think that print is gradually fading away, but we'll always have some sort of printed media, and I think the newspapers of this country are likely to gradually transform themselves into magazine sort of formats. You can, with better paper, you can get better picture reproduction, graphics reproduction, and there's still a pretty good slice of Americans who like to read magazines. So I see newspapers becoming more like magazines and living on in print that way.
Would you be upset if newspapers turned into magazines?
No, I wouldn't be upset at all. The platform is not so important. It's the audience that's important. And you have to worry when an increasing number of Americans are not only reading newspapers less, they're paying less attention to news, period. That was one of the major findings of a recent national poll. I wish it had differentiated, however, between local, state, and national news. I think that in some localities, people are still paying plenty of attention to local news because they've got good local news outlets to provide it. In this town, we have a couple of highly competitive TV stations. I really should say 3. There's a 4th station that is trying hard to compete. And, local news in this town gets covered fairly well, usually superficially, but, they're at least going out and telling you what's going on. And the Herald Leader does a pretty good job of digging deep and picking their shots and trying to have an impact. So the local news environment is not what it could be, but people ought to be happy for what they have, and they ought to support it by buying a subscription. Somebody has to pay for journalism. That is the one thing I hope people listening to this podcast come away with. You can't just expect information to be free, because if it is, it's not going to be reliable. It needs to be produced by professionals who are paid, and they have to be paid now with revenue from the audience, not primarily from advertising, because digital platforms have blown that business model up.
Have you ever wrote a book before?
I've written book chapters, and I am working on a book.
An autobiography by any chance?
No, I don't find my life that interesting, but
I really think you should consider writing an autobiography about yourself.
Well, that might be the last thing I write. But I'm writing a book about Earl Clements, who was governor and senator and Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man in the Senate, and then ran the Tobacco Institute, and was supposedly the man who saved cigarettes for 20 years. kept the government from putting the cigarette companies out of business, which seems like sort of a bad thing to do. But this guy was from Kentucky, which still has more tobacco farmers than any other state.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I will definitely be picking up a copy when it gets published.
Give me a couple of years, at least.
Last question for you. Why should students pick up this special section about the election?
Because the people who will be elected on November 7th will have considerable influence over their lives. And there will be a turnout report. And the people who were elected and not elected, everybody, will be able to see what percentage of people 18 to 24 turned out, as opposed to people over 65 and all the age groups in between. And if things go as they have before, the 18 to 24s will be the lowest turnout segment of the population. And when politicians see that, they think, well, I don't have to pay too much attention to those folks. So speak up so attention will be paid.
That is a great way to end this podcast. Thank you again, Professor Cross, for joining me today on today's episode and shared your background and political coverage and your election thoughts. Tune in to next week's episode with Nate and I. Please don't forget to register to vote. It's never too late to register. A reminder that the election is November 7th. Stay safe, everyone. And as Nate says, outro song.